Beaumont Hall was not merely large, it was a mausoleum of quiet grief, governed by a silence so heavy it seemed woven into the very fabric of the old stone. For 4 years, since the death of his young countess, Edward Beaumont, the Earl of Torrington, had ruled this silence, perfecting the art of emotional austerity until his own formidable presence was colder and more unyielding than the marble statues in his echoing halls. He was the master, yes, but also the keeper of a profound loneliness, a man whose heart had become a fortress of ice. It was into this deep, uncompromising stillness that a small, quiet, and intensely principled chambermaid named Eliza Thorne arrived, unaware that her simple, desperate need for a wage would be the first sound to truly threaten the Earl's perfect, devastating silence. Part 1. The Silent House. The first thing one noticed about Beaumont Hall was not its size, though it sprawled across the Wiltshire landscape like a gray stone leviathan, but its profound, unnatural silence. It was a silence that pressed down, heavy and constant, a shroud woven from memory and neglect. Even the bustle of a dozen working servants seemed muted, as if the very sound were swallowed by the echoing, somber halls. This oppressive stillness was no accident. It was a reflection of the master, Edward Beaumont, the Earl of Torrington. The Earl was 30 years of age, yet carried himself with the weary, rigid posture of a man twice his age. His features were handsome in a severe, classical manner, a strong jaw, a straight, uncompromising nose, and eyes the color of iced peat that rarely flickered with any warmth. He was a man of immense wealth and power, but he was best known throughout the county, and indeed in the social registers of London, as the Ice King. It was a title he had earned fiercely in the 4 years since the passing of his young countess. A bright, laughing creature whose absence had not merely dimmed the house, but had extinguished the light in it altogether. The Earl had retreated into an icy, demanding perfection, governing his estate and his staff with a chilling, impersonal efficiency that brooked no error and permitted no familiarity. It was into this atmosphere of controlled emotional sterility that Eliza Thorne arrived. She stepped down from the hired cart, a small, neat figure dressed in respectable, if faded gray, and surveyed the towering manor. Eliza was 22, with no family to speak of save for a distant, frugal aunt. She had secured the position as a chambermaid, a respectable step above kitchen work with a clear, singular ambition to keep her head down, to perform her duties faultlessly, and to save enough to ensure she would never be adrift again. She possessed a quiet, almost invisible demeanor, yet beneath her stillness lay a core of fierce, unyielding principle and an observant intelligence that missed little, a necessity honed by a life of navigating hardship. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Davies, offered a curt orientation that consisted mainly of warnings. The Earl does not tolerate noise, nor slovenliness, nor sentiment, Mrs. Davies lectured, her voice a dry rasp as she led Eliza through a labyrinth of back passages. You will be seen only when necessary, and not heard ever. Do your duties, Miss Thorne. That is all that is required. Failure is dismissal. Eliza merely inclined her head, her gaze fixed steadily forward. Do your duties. That was simple enough. She did not seek friendship or favor, only employment. For the next fortnight, Eliza was a model of silent industry. She cleaned the fireplaces, aired the bed linens, and polished the silver until it gleamed, moving through the large, quiet manor with the discipline of a soldier. The silence of the house, which others found chilling, Eliza found merely lonely. It was a silence she had grown accustomed to. Edward Beaumont barely registered her existence. His days were an austere ritual of work in his ground-floor study, riding across his lands, and solitary dinners. His staff were mere mechanisms that kept the clockwork of his life functioning perfectly. He knew he had hired a new chambermaid. He knew nothing of her, beyond the fact that the dust motes on his mantle had vanished. The incident that broke this deliberate lack of notice occurred on a wet, blustery Tuesday. Eliza had been charged with cleaning the small library adjoining the Earl's private study, a space he used primarily for retrieving reference materials. The housekeeper had stressed the need for utmost care. The Earl's papers were sacrosanct. Eliza had just begun to dust the mahogany shelves when she heard a faint, distressed whimpering. She paused, her brow furrowed, and traced the sound to a corner behind a stack of maps. There, tucked against the skirting board, was a small, shivering bundle, a mongrel puppy, no bigger than her hand, thin and matted with street grime. It must have slipped in through a loose back door during the downpour. The poor creature was clearly ill, its breathing shallow and labored. A shiver of genuine fear ran down Eliza's spine. A dog, especially one so unkempt, was a serious breach of the house's immaculate order. The Earl would be furious. The easy thing, the safe thing, was to snatch the creature, smuggle it out to the stable block, and pretend it had never been there. But Eliza looked at the trembling creature, at its dull, suffering eyes, and her principled nature asserted itself. It was not just a breach of rules, it was a creature in pain. She could not simply abandon it. She gently lifted the puppy, wrapping it in the corner of her clean apron. She moved to leave the library, intending to ask the kitchen maid for a bowl of broth, when she stopped dead. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the hall light, was the Earl of Torrington. He had entered the study silently, a sheaf of documents in his hand, and stopped, frozen by the sight of his new maid standing mid-room, a grubby, sick dog cradled to her chest. The air in the library seemed to drop 10 degrees. The Earl's face was unreadable, perhaps merely annoyed. "Thorne?" His voice was deep, precisely articulated and utterly devoid of inflection. It was the sound of winter. "What precisely is that in your possession?" Eliza did not flinch, though her stomach twisted with apprehension. She knew she had no excuse. She was ready for the inevitable dismissal. She stepped forward, not toward the door, but slightly into the room so he could see the puppy better. "My lord," she said, her voice quiet but clear, meeting his intimidating gaze directly for a brief, bold instant. "It is a stray, my lord. I believe it slipped in through the south door. It is very ill." He waited, his gaze unwavering. He expected the traditional cascade of apologies, promises, and excuses. Instead, Eliza merely tightened her grip on the small creature. "I beg your pardon for the infraction, my lord. I understand the rules of the house. I shall take it to the stables immediately. If you wish to dismiss me, I accept your judgment, but I cannot leave it to suffer." There was something in her simple, direct defiance, the sheer absence of self-pity or theatricality, that arrested him. She had chosen compassion over her livelihood and owned the choice without reservation. Her quiet strength, the steel beneath the gray, registered on him like a sudden, unexpected draft of cold air. He looked from her face, clean and unremarkable but for the serious intelligence in her gray-blue eyes, down to the pathetic bundle in her apron. He saw the gentle, instinctive curve of her arm, the way her hand shielded the puppy's head. He despised weakness. He despised sentiment. Yet he suddenly recognized something in the maid's action that resonated with the hidden, aching core of himself. It was a willingness to face pain head-on, to acknowledge suffering instead of simply sweeping it away. It was a strength born of quiet endurance, something he understood all too well. The silence stretched, heavier now, as he made a deliberate, unexpected calculation. "The stable-master is not a veterinarian, Thorne," he finally stated, his tone flat. He paused, looking away toward the cold fireplace. "There is a small shed adjoining the kitchens. Disinfect it. I shall require the library back in 10 minutes. And see that the housekeeper is informed of your extracurricular activities." It was not an order to dismiss her. It was a command to care for the dog, an acknowledgement of its reality. Eliza felt a surprising flood of relief, quickly stifled into a respectful formality. "Yes, my lord. Thank you, my lord." She curtsied swiftly and retreated, clutching the puppy. As she slipped through the doorway, she risked one final glance back. The Earl had not moved. He was standing exactly as she had found him, looking at the door she had just vacated, his expression utterly blank. But Eliza had seen the fleeting moment of recognition, the flicker of some unspoken emotion that had stopped his censure. Edward Beaumont, the Ice King, was left alone in his silent library. He dropped his documents onto his desk without looking and stared at the empty space where the maid and the wretched dog had stood. He had barely seen her face before today, yet now he could recall the exact serious line of her mouth and the surprising intensity in her eyes. He thought of the dog, a worthless, doomed scrap of life, and the maid's willingness to jeopardize her position for it, a quiet strength that mirrors the pain he tries to suppress. He ran a hand over his jaw. He had intended to dismiss her instantly. Why had he not? He found he did not know, but he knew, with a certainty that was both troubling and foreign, that he would be observing her now, against his will. The silence of Beaumont Hall had suddenly been disturbed, not by a noise, but by a quiet, principled act of humanity. Part 2. Slow Thaw. The incident of the stray puppy, whom Eliza had quietly named Pip, was not, as the Earl had instructed, officially recorded by Mrs. Davies, but it served as the invisible hinge upon which the quiet rhythm of Beaumont Hall now began to turn. Eliza was permitted to keep the recovering creature in the small, clean shed, an unheard-of liberty for a chambermaid, and one that Edward Beaumont had granted with a singular, detached sentence. The granting of the favor was baffling to the staff. It was a crack in the Ice King's armor, subtle but profound. For Edward, his reluctant permission had merely shifted the focus of his unwanted observation. He did not seek her out, yet he became acutely aware of her presence. He found his gaze drawn to the fleeting glimpse of her gray skirt as she swept down a corridor, or the sight of her small, neat figure tending the window boxes he had never noticed before. He was a man who prized control above all else, control of his emotions, his estate, his staff. Yet he could not control the small, insistent curiosity that Eliza Thorne evoked. She moved through his house like a shadow, yet a particularly clean and necessary one. Her attention to detail, the perfect pleat of a curtain, the fresh, non-stuffy air in a room, the way she managed to clean without producing a single grating noise was precisely what he demanded, but it was the quiet,
principled soul beneath the diligence that truly confounded him. Their accidental encounters began as brief, charged episodes, always in the liminal spaces of the house where the boundaries of upstairs and downstairs blurred.
One chilly afternoon, Edward descended to the great library, a place where the Earl, being a dedicated scholar of estate management, spent hours. He found Eliza there, perched delicately atop a small rolling stepladder, her hands wrapped around a heavy, leather-bound volume. She was dusting the upper shelves, but in the dim, late light, he saw that she was not merely wiping the covers. She was gazing, rapt, at a page. She did not hear his approach on the thick carpet. Edward stopped, observing her. The light from the high window caught the curve of her slender neck and the concentration etched on her face. The book she held was The Lives of the Roman Emperors, a dense historical text, hardly the sort of trivial novel usually found in the hands of a chambermaid. He cleared his throat. Eliza started violently, the heavy book slipping from her grasp. Edward was across the room in 3 long strides, catching the volume mid-air before it could strike the floor, a movement born of practiced reflex, protecting the object, not the maid. He held the book, his hand dwarfing the worn cover. Eliza was already descending the ladder, her cheeks flushed with mortification. "My lord, I beg your pardon. I was merely—" "You were merely neglecting your duties for intellectual pursuits, Miss Thorne," he finished flatly, his voice cool and judging. He placed the book back on the shelf with deliberate care. She stood before him, her hands clasped tightly, her posture stiff with fear of transgression. "I apologize, my lord. I should not have paused. It was merely a curiosity. I shall not make the mistake again." Edward looked at her. He expected the fear, but not the hint of sorrow in her eyes, the sorrow of a quiet mind starved of sustenance. "Do you read Latin, Thorne?" he asked, the question escaping him before he could halt it. It was utterly outside the bounds of a master-servant conversation. Eliza hesitated, caught in the snare of the question. To admit knowledge was to admit ambition, to invite further scrutiny. But her principle forbade a lie. "A small degree, my lord," she admitted softly. "My former mistress was kind enough to allow me use of her schoolroom books before she died. Only very simple texts." He regarded her, a slow, intense perusal that made her feel as transparent as glass. A flicker of something akin to admiration, or perhaps baffled interest, crossed his severe face. "Curiosity, Miss Thorne, is a troublesome vice in a position such as yours," he stated, his voice a low, warning rumble. "It leads to questions, and questions lead to dissatisfaction." He did not dismiss her. He merely turned and walked to his desk. Eliza stood for a long moment, trembling not from fear, but from the raw, inexplicable charge of the encounter. He had seen her, not the maid who polished silver, but the woman who hungered for knowledge. The physical distance between them remained, him at the large desk, she still near the books, but the intellectual barrier had momentarily collapsed, leaving them standing on the same plane of thought. Edward did not look at her again, but when he finally called out, his voice was measured. "You may continue your work, Thorne, but ensure the books are returned correctly." He had given her a warning, not a punishment. He had recognized her silent mind, and the truth of it was terrifying to Eliza, for it gave him a power over her she had not anticipated. The weeks that followed were marked by this growing, unwilling familiarity. Edward began to leave books he thought she might enjoy on a lower shelf, a subtle, almost clandestine act of patronage. Eliza never acknowledged them, but the next day they were always returned, carefully dusted, to their original place. The second crucial moment arrived with the fury of a winter tempest. It was late November. A harsh, freezing rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the chimneys of Beaumont Hall like a mournful spirit. The Earl had been out since dawn, inspecting a timber yard on the furthest edge of his estate, and was expected back before nightfall. He returned well past dark. Eliza, on a last-minute round to draw the heavy curtains and ensure the fires were banked, was traversing the main hall when she heard the heavy thud of the front door being forced open. Edward entered, his greatcoat plastered to his formidable frame, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the polished stone floor, a sight that would have earned the housemaid a severe dressing-down. He was not merely wet, he was soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. As he pulled off his sodden gloves, Eliza noticed a darker stain on the side of his mud-splattered tweed coat just below his ribs. He was injured, perhaps thrown from his horse in the terrible weather. The butler, who had admitted him, hovered nervously, unsure how to proceed. Edward merely ran a hand over his face, his expression drawn and tight with pain. "I require a hot bath and brandy, Gibbs," he ground out, his voice hoarse from the cold. "No fuss, no doctor, a mere scrape." Eliza stepped forward, her quiet voice cutting through the butler's uncertain stammer. "My lord, you are bleeding," she said simply, pointing to the wound with a steady hand. "And you have the fever already in your eyes. A scrape does not bring the chill so quickly. You must have the coat off immediately, and a servant must attend to the cut." Edward turned his cold, peat-colored eyes upon her, annoyed at the intrusion, yet momentarily stunned by her forthright command. "Mind your place, Thorne," he warned, though his shivering betrayed the weakness in his tone. "My place, my lord, is to ensure the smooth running of your house," Eliza retorted, folding her hands and meeting his gaze with a terrifying calm. "A feverish master is not a smoothly running master. I cannot mend the tear in your coat if you contract pleurisy and perish. Allow me to summon Mrs. Davies. You must be dried and warmed." Her use of logic, of cold, efficient practicality, was the only language he seemed to respect. Edward stared at her, caught between his instinct to dismiss her insolence and the profound physical need for her quiet, assured competence. "Very well," he conceded, the word dragged from him like a stone. "Summon the housekeeper. But I require no coddling." He was already stumbling toward the main staircase. As he moved, a sudden, blinding flash of lightning illuminated the hall. A powerful clap of thunder shook the ancient glass in the windows, and Edward, perhaps distracted, or perhaps merely weakened by the fever taking hold, misjudged a step. He reached out to steady himself, his injured side taking the weight, and he let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain before catching himself on the banister. The days and nights that followed were a blur of cool cloths, hushed footfalls, and the smell of antiseptic. Eliza changed his dressing with a firm yet gentle touch, administering his prescribed laudanum with a steady hand. She saw him not as the cold-hearted Earl, but as a patient, stripped of his authority, vulnerable and human. Edward, too weak to maintain his iron rigidity, watched her. He saw her competence, the total absence of the simpering adoration or awkward fussing he expected. She treated his body with professional detachment, but his comfort with quiet care. One night, the fever peaked. Edward awoke suddenly, thrashing, his brow slick with sweat. "No, Penelope, no!" he groaned, his eyes unfocused, calling out the name of his late wife. "I should have stopped you. I should have—" Eliza sat by his bed, holding a porcelain cup of water. "Hush, my lord.
It is only the fever. You are safe. You are in your room." His eyes snapped open, clearing slowly until they settled on her face. For a moment, the mask of the Earl was completely gone, replaced by the raw, unfettered grief of the man. "You remind me of her," he whispered, his voice ravaged by the fever and his pain. "Not in looks, but in the quiet strength, the way you look at suffering and don't flinch." He closed his eyes, and a single, scalding tear escaped the corner of his eye and tracked down his temple. "It's so quiet now, Thorne," he confessed, the weakness of his voice a profound admission. "I keep the house silent, but it is not silence I crave. It is only the absence of the noise she left behind. It is so very, terribly lonely."
Eliza looked at the powerful, broken man before her. She understood that kind of loneliness. It was the same one that resided beneath the silence of the manor's walls. She placed her hand on his forearm, a tiny, simple gesture that momentarily shattered the immutable boundary of class. It was not a lover's touch, but a soul's solace. "I know, my lord," she whispered, her voice husky with shared empathy. "I know." She held his gaze until his eyes drifted shut and his breathing deepened into sleep. The barrier was irrevocably broken. Edward had revealed a sliver of the loneliness and pain that had hardened him, and Eliza had met his vulnerability not with judgment, but with gentle, profound understanding. Part 3. Defying the upstairs-downstairs. The fever broke, but the rigid structure of Beaumont Hall remained permanently altered. Edward, now restored to his formidable health, was again the Earl of Torrington, master of his domain, remote and commanding. Yet, when Eliza Thorne stood before him, the distance between them was not the width of a drawing room, but the whisper of a shared secret. He had confessed to her the loneliness that had made him an ice king. She had confessed, with the simple act of her touch, that she understood him. The awkward, unbearable tension that settled over the manor was noticed by all. Edward, now longer pale and feverish, found his private study a suffocating tomb. He knew why. He had spent days stripped of his title, cared for by the only person who did not flinch from his brokenness. Now the mask was back, but it felt brittle. He longed for the simple, quiet truth of Eliza's presence, the steady, unspoken affection that had nursed him back to life. Eliza, for her part, deliberately retreated to the shadows. She scrubbed harder, worked longer, and refused to catch his eye. The memory of her hand on his arm, of the tear on his pillow, was a constant, dangerous warmth. She had crossed an invisible line. She had seen the man, not the Lord, and her heart, which she had so carefully guarded, now held a perilous tenderness for him. The social chasm was not merely a few flights of stairs. It was an abyss. She was a maid. He was an earl. Society had rules, harsh, unyielding, drawn in ink on every map of their world. For him to pursue her would be a scandal that would taint his ancient title. For her to accept would mean ruin, the loss of her hard-won respectability, and the utter destruction of her place in the world. Her greatest fear was that he might compromise her without intending a future, driven only by the intimacy of his illness. Her principle insisted on retreat. The catalyst for their reckoning arrived in the form of Lady Beatrice Beaumont, the Dowager Duchess of Somerset, Edward's aunt, and a self-appointed authority on all matters of propriety and succession. Lady Beatrice swept into the silent hall like a gale wind, accompanied by a glittering entourage and an expectation of instant, cheerful conformity.
She was loud, she was commanding, and she had one mission: to secure a new, suitable countess for her nephew. "Edward, my dear boy," she announced over a dinner table that suddenly felt too small, "it has been 4 years of mourning. The line must be secured. I have written to Lady Henrietta, the purest bred girl in the county. You need sunshine, not these ghastly echoing stones." Edward listened, his posture as stiff as the mantelpiece. He was being discussed like a prized stud animal. The very thought of introducing a laughing, flighty young countess into the house felt like a sacrilege against the profound peace he had recently found. His gaze flickered to the doorway, where Eliza stood briefly, collecting a discarded napkin, efficient, quiet, and utterly unremarkable to his aunt. To Edward, she was the still point in his turning world. That night, alone in his study, Edward felt the pressure of his life, his title, his ancestors, his duty, crush him. He was the Ice King, and the ice was suffocating him. He despised the way his own family saw him as a tool for their name, utterly devoid of personal choice. He could not marry Lady Henrietta. He could not go back to the silence of his emotional isolation. He wanted the quiet truth of Eliza, the human connection she offered. He rose suddenly and strode out, ignoring the late hour and the bewildered glance of the duty footman. He knew exactly where to find her. Eliza was in the main parlor, on her hands and knees, tending to the massive hearth. She had stayed late, polishing the brass fender until it glowed, needing the physical exertion to combat the yearning in her heart. Edward stood in the doorway, watching her. Her uniform was simple, her hair coiled into a neat, practical knot, and she was utterly unconscious of her inherent grace. She was beauty born not of silks and chandeliers, but of fire and truth. She sensed his presence, slowly straightened and turned, her expression guarded. "My lord, is there something you require?" "Yes," Edward stated, stepping into the room. His voice was low, devoid of its usual frosty precision, charged instead with an unsteady intensity. "I require honesty, Thorne. I have been watching you, since the dog, since the fever. I cannot stop." Eliza bowed her head, her hands clutching the polishing rag. "My lord, I am your maid. I understand the position. I will not cause trouble. I will resign my post if my presence is an inconvenience to you." "A convenience?" Edward scoffed, his eyes blazing with a heat that was more alarming than his usual coldness. He moved closer, closing the distance slowly, deliberately, forcing her to look up. "You are my peace, Eliza. You are the only soul who has not flinched from the pain that hardened me. Do you believe I can simply dismiss that?" "You must, my lord," she whispered, her voice laced with anguish. "Or you risk everything. I risk everything. Your family, your title. Lady Beatrice is already here. She will never permit it. Society will destroy you." The truth of her words was like a blow. The chasm was real. Edward paused, his gaze fixing on her face, seeing the fear there and the quiet affection beneath it. "Do you care for me, Eliza?" he demanded, the question raw and necessary. A single tear escaped her, an answer more honest than any word. "I am terrified for you, my lord. I have seen the man you hide. I cannot bear to see him crushed by duty for a choice he does not wish to make." "Then do not ask me to sacrifice the only thing that offers me solace," he stated firmly. He took the brass polish from her hand, dropping it onto the stone hearth. He gently lifted her chin, forcing her gaze to meet his. He did not touch her, not a physical compromise, but an emotional challenge. The world wants me to choose between my name and my happiness. Very well, he said, his voice dropping to a decisive, unbreakable vow. I choose my peace. I choose you. This was the core of his defiance. He would not be ruled by the judgment of the Ton.
I will not compromise your reputation, Eliza. I will not destroy your life to satisfy my own need for comfort. I will make a choice so radical, so absolute, that it answers every social demand, by dismissing them entirely. The next morning, the man who had been the solitary, glacial Earl of Torrington summoned his formidable Aunt Beatrice to the library. He was waiting, impeccably dressed, when she arrived. His face was unreadable, his resolve set. "Aunt," he began, handing her a folded, official-looking document. "I have heard your concerns regarding the succession and my isolation. They are noted. However, my future is no longer a topic for public debate." Lady Beatrice looked at the document, a gasp freezing in her throat. It was not a marriage contract, but a notice of his immediate, temporary departure from the country, a lengthy period of travel and estate business abroad, citing restoration of health and spirit. "Edward, what is the meaning of this? You cannot simply abandon your estates." "I am not abandoning them. I am securing my peace," he stated, his voice ringing with a new, quiet authority. "I shall not be marrying Lady Henrietta, nor anyone else from London society. I shall be taking one member of my staff with me, a quiet, capable woman who understands my needs and my temperament." Lady Beatrice was already turning purple, but Edward held up a hand, preventing her tirade. "I will secure a quiet marriage abroad in Vienna, under the strictest privacy. Upon our return, she will be my countess. Those who wish to call upon us may do so, and those who choose to gossip shall be ignored. I will not allow a maid to be called a mistress, nor allow my future wife to be dismissed as a piece of property." He had chosen the boldest, most private path. Legal marriage, performed far from the clutches of English society, allowing him to return with a wife already cemented in her new position. Lady Beatrice was sputtering, but Edward only looked to the parlor doorway. Eliza, pale but resolute, stood there, summoned by a quiet word from the butler. She was wearing her maid's uniform, but her gaze was fixed on Edward, firm and unwavering. "Eliza Thorne," Edward stated, his voice clear, not for his aunt, but for the history of the house. "You are not merely my servant, but my soul's solace. I offer you my name, my life, and my loyalty. It will not be an easy life, but it will be an honest one. Do you choose fire and truth over silence and safety?" Eliza met the gaze of the Ice King, whose eyes were finally melting, warmed by the profound choice he had made. She saw not the Earl, but the wounded man who had offered her his whole, aching heart. She took a single, definitive step forward, her chin lifted in a gesture of proud acceptance. "I do, my lord." Edward's stern features relaxed, a ghost of the rare, reluctant smile finally appearing, this time with genuine, enduring happiness. Their love story was cemented, not by fairy tales, but by this fire and truth, a clean and sweet tale of two wounded souls finding quiet, profound solace, and an affection that defied the oppressive walls of class, ushering in the unexpected dawn of a shared life.